Hey, hello, U.S. history students. Here is our first lecture. Don't worry about what it's saying lecture three. I'm using some and not bothering with others, so don't worry about that. But we're going to be talking this week about the Separatists and the Pilgrims. Last week we looked at Jamestown and some of the early explorers and the American Trinity. But now I want to look at the next set of settlers that arrived after Jamestown, and those were two groups into the New England area or Massachusetts called the Separatists and the Pilgrims. So let's jump right in. And again, your notes that you'll be taking in the slide deck, they're organized into kind of three broad categories. And then the fourth one is the kind of the so what conclusion. So you'll see the little Roman numeral up top. That's where notes can go in the first section, where we'll be talking about the religious conflict that's kind of the background to the Pilgrims and the Separatists, or the Separatists who are the Pilgrims, as we'll see, and the Puritans. Okay, so the religious conflict, what drove these people out of Europe? Why was the New World actually such a refuge and opportunity, even though, as we saw last week, how dangerous and life-threatening that voyage and then attempt to settle could be? Well, that was because Europe was in turmoil religiously following the Protestant Revolution. The splintering of the Catholic Church in 1517, a little bit even before that, but with Martin Luther in 1517, it really tore Europe in half and created a lot of opportunity for conflict and violence. Some people say that the settlement of America, or settlement of the New World, was based upon the unsettlement of Europe. In other words, a breaking apart and a turmoil exploding there over religious lines between the Protestants and the Catholics. And three major spheres for this conflict were the Huguenots, the 30 Years' War, and the Separatists and the Puritans, who I'll address right now. So the Huguenots, just we want to think of them as French Calvinists. So they were French Protestants. So in other words, each country, or most of the European countries, had kind of a breakout of Protestants who wanted to believe the Catholic Church and worship in the Protestant fashion, focusing on faith in Jesus Christ, the Bible as the sole authority, salvation by faith. And so in France, these Protestants were known as Huguenots. And the reason I bring them up is because when we see what happens to them, it really is a picture of what might have happened to all of Protestantism in Europe if the New World had not been available, and including what kind of started to happen even in England. And that is, again, the ongoing conflict. In France, you had a Catholic monarch. France was a very Catholic nation. They were closely allied with Rome and the Pope. In fact, some of the popes were even lived in France during the Middle Ages. And it culminated in this event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And this was just a massive uprising of mob violence by French Catholics against the Calvinists. And there's a lot of politics that went into it that we don't need to look at that at this point. But basically, it was a period of weeks and I think a couple months of basically mob violence in which, almost like if you know anything about the Rwandan genocide, where one group of Frenchmen turned on the other group because they were perceived as dangerous Protestants, and it kind of all being presided over and blessed by the Catholic monarchy. And so in that time, you can see that's quite a range, 5,000 to 30,000 dead. That's because there was no real attempt to try to count the deaths because it was the government that was kind of overseeing the massacre. But it was just an absolutely brutal time from not only Paris, but on throughout the countryside and various cities of France, in which, again, Catholics would grab Protestant priests, Protestant worshipers, and go various forms of murder and torture in order to stamp out this heresy that was being perceived, a threat to the Catholic monarchy. It finally culminated in something called the Edict of Nantes, in which the Huguenots were finally granted a couple little small portions or regions within France in which they could basically coexist and be like, okay, as long as you stay in these special Protestant zones, we'll stop trying to wipe you out. But what that officially basically did was affirm that France would stay Catholic, which was kind of the goal. They wanted to make sure we are not going to become a Protestant nation. This was happening in Germany, was becoming largely Protestant. Switzerland, largely Protestant. England, we'll see this was happening. So France basically, through these massacres, basically said, we're not going to have Protestantism. And to this day, Protestantism does not have much of a foothold in France. It's still most of its legacy is still Catholic. Continent-wide, across all of Europe, this unsettlement kind of took the form of the 30 Years' War. And this was just basically a bloody war between Calvinists. And when you see Calvinists, that was a Protestant group battling against their attempt to break away from the Catholic Church all throughout all throughout Europe. It started kind of in Germany and parts of what we call the Holy Roman Empire, but it spread all throughout Europe. Um, and so basically, it was just a continent-wide civil war. And today, Europe is very, very secular, and a lot of people point to this moment right here, a 30-year, brutal, basically religious war between Catholics and Protestants. Now, I just said religious war, but the second point there about princes having power to determine the faith of their kingdom, what that really meant is, although it was, Catholics versus Protestants, the reason that mattered so much is because it basically fell along political lines. That if you were pro Pope, if you were pro monarch who was Catholic, then you said, oh, we're the Catholics and we're going to go kill all the Protestants. It wasn't because they really thought, oh, they're reading the Bible wrong. It was because they were actually a threat to their political power. And so the reason it took up such arms is because your religious affiliation actually meant less about your personal faith and more about who you were loyal to politically. And so if you were a Catholic ruler, you didn't want Protestants in your nation because you saw that as treasonous. Notice there's no concept of freedom of worship in this world. And that's why what's going to eventually develop in America is just going to be an incredible breakthrough for Christianity. But notice that number there at the bottom, 8 million dead. For the population at the time, that was horrendous. And like I said, in some ways, people argue that Europe still, other than maybe the world wars, in their mind, that their hatred, and a lot of them or resistance, we'll say, to religion goes back to this memory of this terrible war. Even though, again, it wasn't exactly really over Jesus and the Bible. It was religion had become so political; they were really having political divisions. As I just said, that changes Europe. It ends with the what's known as the Peace of Westphalia, and that basically they sign a truce and basically say, okay, we'll let regional princes decide what the faith of their nation. So rather than the Pope or the Catholic Church stepping into every individual country and saying, well, you have to be Catholic, you can't have Protestants, the Peace of Westphalia basically gave authority to the kings or princes of local nations to determine, okay, what the faith of their nation would be. And so we're going to move up to England next, and we'll see it's then the king, not the Pope, who's getting to make the calls on what sort of worship is allowed and which is not. And you can see that implies kind of the development of a secular nation state, where again the government is no longer under the control of the Catholic Church, which throughout the Middle Ages was the most powerful institution in Europe. And so what does this look like in England? We're slowly moving into where we're going to get the Separatists and the Puritans. It starts with King James. King James was a Catholic king of England. He was sympathetic to Catholicism. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, if you know her. She's the one who tried to take the throne from the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth had her executed, one of those things that ticked off Philip II, leading to the Spanish Armada. But even though Mary is executed, Elizabeth, again, the Virgin Queen, she dies without children, and so it's actually her rival's son, James I, who takes the throne. And he, again, has Catholic sympathies. And so he sought the right to, he like all rulers, said, you know what, I want to consolidate the faith and the type of worship in my nation so that it's loyal to me. And he is King James. He's the famous because he is the, not the writer, but the one who paid for and commissioned the writing of the King James Bible. And that's a powerful, story in of itself. But the commissioning of that Bible, in his eyes, was actually an attempt to unify England under his religious guidance. He wanted all the people reading his Bible, not their own Bibles. There were Protestant or Calvinist Bibles that people would read. He wanted to get rid of those because they said things like "No king but Jesus," which no monarch wanted people reading. And so the King James Bible was an attempt to consolidate the faith within England. And part of that was then to persecute factions, any type of Christian who didn't want to worship the official Church of England way that he was trying to implement. And so that finally brings us to the groups that are being persecuted because they did not want to do it King James's way. They didn't want to read the King James Bible. They did not want to swear allegiance to him over, Jesus Christ. So brings us to 1620, the Plymouth Colony. So this is now part 2 of your notes. And we call these people the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims. We'll see in a minute. They're also known as the Separatists. The reason they were called the Separatists, let me see, do I have a slide on that? Yeah, they're the Separatists because they said, The Church of England is corrupt. The Catholic Church was really corrupt, but even the church under King James is corrupt. And we want to worship independently how the Bible and our own consciences lead us. And so their first attempt was to leave England and go to Holland, where 300 separatists went to Holland. As you can see, they multiplied and did well, had babies, got converts, and grew over more than 3 times in size. But eventually the family said, you know what, we can't stay in Holland because now our kids, instead of speaking English, they're starting to speak Dutch. And Holland is a very mercantile, very cosmopolitan city, and they're kind of picking up sinful behaviors. They're not being set apart and holy according to just the scriptures. There's too much rap music there in Holland, kind of thing, unbiblical rap music. And so they say, we need a fresh start. We can't go back to England. King James won't let us be there. Holland is too corrupting, and we're losing our English heritage. And so they made the momentous decision, let's go to the New World and make a fresh start. Which again, hopefully you appreciate what a massive step and what a dangerous step that was. But they were desperate to leave the oppression and the state control that was happening in the churches in Europe for a new start. And so their leader was a pastor named William Bradford. This is a quote just because it gets you into the mindset of what these people were trying to do. This is Bradford. We have great hope and inward zeal of laying some good foundation for the propagating and advancing of the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ in these remote parts of the world. Yea, though they should be as stepping stones to others for performing of so great a work. And I love that quote because it's powerfully prophetic. It's powerfully prophetic. We are those who have walked across the stepping stones. In other words, we live in a Christian nation full of prosperity and religious freedom and opportunity and laws and even a government and a constitution based upon biblical principles. None of that existed about 250 years ago, 300 years ago. And yet it was this group of Christians saying, no, we want to follow the Bible. We want to do it God's way. We want to try something new without the burdens and the corruptions of the past. And they said, so we're going to lay a foundation, just the beginning. The fun part of a house is not the foundation. The fun part of the house is the cool windows and the double stories and the 3 bathrooms and whatever, all the nice things, big kitchen sink, whatever you like in your house, your bed. But the foundation is, without the foundation, that house doesn't stand. And that's what the Pilgrims or the Separatists basically said they were. They said, we'll go and be a foundation, and though it's very remote and though it's the middle of nowhere, again, we're going to go to Mars. You can almost imagine if Mars became a place in which you could have a form of religious freedom if there was some sort of crazy Antichrist stuff going on here on Earth. They said, we will go there just so we can be stepping stones so that others can follow us and perform such great a work. That's prophetic. That is, they saw in their mind's eye what God could use them for, and we in America are enjoying that. Just details of the voyage. Recommend go watch Charlie Brown, Mayflower Voyage. It's a fun little cartoon. We'd normally watch it in class if we were here. But they set out on a charter with the London Company. Half the crew was guys known as strangers or adventurers. Everybody on the boat were not the Separatists or the Pilgrims. They were just going to have an adventure. They were going to make money. They were kind of like the Jamestown settlers. And so they crammed aboard the Mayflower ship for a 65-day voyage. They originally had 2 ships. One was known as the Speedwell, but it was too leaky and it began to sink right off the coast of England. And so they quickly had to have some people stay and cram everybody else aboard the Mayflower. This made for a miserable voyage. Again, 65 days, so over 2 months. Over 2 months they're at sea. They left late, and so they didn't have good winds. They didn't end up arriving until November 9th in 1620. And the important part about that voyage is the fact that they hit such horrible weather that they missed their target. They were actually headed for Virginia. Jamestown and the area around it, again, going to such a remote region, if you're going to settle Mars, you'd want to land somewhere close to where there already was a settlement so you could team up and pool your resources. That's what the Separatists had intended to do, but instead the storm blew them all the way north from Virginia up to Cape Cod off Massachusetts. And so when they arrive after a very difficult voyage, but in the completely wrong place, a wilderness of wildernesses, and they have no authority, they have no permission to be there. Their charter from the king said, you can go to Jamestown, Virginia. And you're going to read the Mayflower Compact and you'll see that. But instead, they wind up in a totally different location. Just a little map of Massachusetts and Cape Cod. where they were able to find shelter. They originally tried to sail south down to Virginia when they knew they were in the wrong spot, but the weather was too bad, it was too dangerous, so they decided to set up the Plymouth, the famous Plymouth Rock and famous Plymouth settlement that you can go visit today. So as I said, it's a mistake. They landed in Plymouth by mistake, and so they create this thing we know as the Mayflower Compact. They called it, it wasn't, they didn't call it that, but it was a covenant to say, you know what, we don't have any permission to be here. There's no other form of government here, so we need to set up our own form of government. And so they set up the Mayflower Compact that outlines the rules for their new society, and we're going to read that during our live session. If you know the story, over half of the settlers die in the first horrible winter. They start to get wiped out. Many of them say, let's just get through the winter and we're going to go back home. This is another failed settlement attempt. But miraculously, Squanto shows up, a Native American who was an ex-slave who had learned English and who ended up teaching the settlers how to survive, and was able to give them enough confidence and experience in order to decide, you know what, the bulk of them, we're going to stay and we're going to maintain our Plymouth colony. And the first Thanksgiving was in fact a fall feast following the dreadful winter, but then prosperous spring and summer of thanks that they had survived and that they had been saved by Squanto and the other Wampanoag Indians, and that they were going to stay. That's, the Thanksgiving story is not a myth. There's truth to that. I think so much of us, whether it was, we talked about Pocahontas and John Smith, we think, oh, this stuff's all just made up. No. And in fact, it's even more miraculous than I'm going to take time to explain here, but maybe we'll talk about that live. They, unlike the Jamestown settlers, are much better off at making peace with the Native Americans. They actually form a treaty that lasts for something like 60 or to 80 years, and they establish a Bible-based society. The Mayflower Covenant, they called it the Plymouth Combination, which they all the free men aboard signed before they went ashore. Basically, that said we are going to had three principles. They said we're going to rule by mutual consent. In other words, nobody's being forced into this government. I'm agreeing to these laws because I freely and mutually choose to join it. That's a radical idea. They said we are going to be self-governing. In other words, we're not going to have a king on top of us, and we're not going to have a lord or a nobility or an aristocracy ruling over us. We're going to govern ourselves. And so we get this idea of self-government, mutual consent, self-government, and then it outlines in that Mayflower Compact the idea of equal justice, equal laws and justice for all. So in other words, no matter who you are, you're going to be under the same laws and treated by the same standards of justice. And all three of these things are biblically based ideas that we'll get into, and all three of these end up basically being in that Mayflower Covenant or that Plymouth Combination. We have the seeds of our American Declaration of Independence and our U.S. Constitution. And so it is absolutely an important stepping stone indeed to creating a nation on earth that nobody had ever seen before. Again, based upon those principles: mutual consent, self-government, and equal laws and justice for all. Hey, sounds like a Pledge of Allegiance. Key people in the Plymouth colony: William Brewster, he was the pastor for the colony, and then William Bradford was the colony for over 30 years. And we'll talk a little bit. The big other key moment came for William Bradford was a Jamestown-like moment where they too tried to have a communal system in which they shared everything, and your work did not dictate your own private property, but everything you did went to the common good and everybody shared. Again, led to scarcity very, very quickly. And Bradford, to his credit, switched quickly to a capitalist system in which people could farm their own land, own their own land, keep their own produce, keep the fruits of their labor, and immediately things turned around and they began to work harder and produce enough to survive. So key precedents of the Plymouth colony: self-government, popular because it comes from the people. They did in fact have a separation of church and state. They did not mix the religious authorities with their governing authorities. Again, they had a pastor and a governor. It wasn't a governor-pastor. That's important. So a separation of the civil government and the religious government. And they had a pretty strong level of religious toleration, in which you didn't have to be a separatist for them to, they didn't think of you as a heretic or go out of their way to persecute you. And we're going to see that's a little bit in contrast to the last group we'll talk about, which are the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the Plymouth Colony, 1620. 10 years later, we get the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this is when James's successor, Charles I, he steps into power, and he's going to take his level of authority, his divine right of king, one step further. He's going to try to eliminate all representative government in England, but that's more of a tale for European history. But in other words, he's really going to stamp out. He was much more ardent. If James was sympathetic to Catholicism, Charles I sought to maybe reinstate Catholicism as the national religion of England. And so even Puritans had to flee. The key difference between Separatists and Puritans is the Separatists thought, you know what, we're going to just separate from the English church and go do our own thing in the New World. The Puritans, they had tried to purify the English church. They wanted to stay part of it and kind of clean it up and make it more biblical. But once Charles I came into power and basically was going to completely oppress, even stamp out any attempt at Protestantism or Protestant reform, even the Puritans said, we're out of here. We need to start over somewhere else. And so this colony, the Puritan colony, was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's because they were a company. They were a joint stock company of Puritan businessmen. But what they did is when they got the charter to start their business, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they didn't stipulate where their headquarters would be. So in other words, it wasn't like Charles I would say, hey, all you heretical Puritans, go live in the New World, and I'm okay with that. No, they were able to set up a business. That business happened to be all Puritan businessmen who went to kind of like people going to the same church. And then they said, oh, by the way, our headquarters, it's in Massachusetts. And so they were able to use their business charter to then transfer their headquarters and take their business over to the New World. And so what was at first an all Puritan company basically becomes an all Puritan self-governing colony over in the New World. So they were able to use their business license kind of to basically create a new religious colonial license and escape to the New World. Much larger group. The Pilgrims were one ship, 100 plus people. The Puritans, 11 ships carrying over 700 passengers. And so it was a much larger migration. And again, their goal similarly was to build a society to fully embody God's truth. They wanted to say, you know what, we're going to build the kind of city, the kind of civilization or society that follows the Bible. It was very utopian in that mindset. They wanted to show the world what could be achieved if you lived wholly and completely and freshly as a fresh start for God. We get the famous phrase, we'll read it, but they wanted to be a city up on a hill for all the world to see. Same map, but you can note the location of Boston versus Plymouth. They were near neighbors, but Boston was the city founded by the Massachusetts Bay Company. And again, their success and even their size is noted by which city ends up being larger today. Boston ends up being a much more successful, it has a better harbor city than Plymouth. So Boston is the Puritans, Plymouth was the Pilgrims or Separatists. Okay, leader of the Puritans was John Winthrop. They kind of saw him as their Moses, leading them all to the promised land. The sermon you'll be reading this week is his most famous, The Model of Christian Charity, in which he outlines the kind of society that they want to be. And again, where he makes the biblical reference for wanting to be considered a city upon the hill and that all the eyes of the world would be looking upon them. They wanted to glorify God and say, we're going to really show how it's done. And, again, really was, in a way, it was not fulfilled. We'll talk about, they don't end up having the most perfect society, and some things they did, many modern Americans or even Christian Americans wouldn't agree with. But it really was a prophecy of America's future greatness. When people say we're a Christian nation or that we are an exceptional nation, this is what we're talking about. It doesn't mean we're somehow ethnically, physically superior to any other nation on the earth, or even maybe morally superior. But the vision that founded America, the vision of these people coming here, what they were trying to do, they were really coming to try to glorify God. They were really trying to be something different. They wanted to do something great for God. And this was a powerful prophecy because the United States has been a wonderful blessing overall much greater. We have our own flaws, we have issues, but nothing in comparison to the blessing and the freedom and the prosperity that this country has given so many people around the world. And that was the desire. It's like Abraham becoming the one single father to then the massive nation of the Jews, and then even the larger kingdom of Christians. That's what these people were for the United States. And they came over with the idea that their principal duty was not for themselves. Nobody who cared about their own comfort was going to come to the New World, but they wanted to celebrate the common good. They wanted to live together in love, and we'll talk about that more when we dig into his sermon. So the precedent set by the Puritans was, again, self-government. They came over and they said, we're going to govern ourselves according to the Bible. We're going to be a shining example. They established this idea of liberty, which we defined, again, as not just freedom. I can do whatever I want, and we're going to talk about that too. Another reading will do, but that we're going to have liberty, which comes with duties. That if I want to be free, I have certain responsibilities that I have to hold to. They also firmly established the idea that government should be limited. Government should only be able to have the powers that the people consent to. So in other words, the whole reason that government exists is to help the people who want to live their lives better. It's not somebody being in charge and taking control of other people, but it's, in other words, that they only have authority to begin with, and they should only control the least amount possible to provide a better society, protection and direction for the people being governed. It's kind of like thinking, I'm not a teacher, and so I need to go find students. That's backwards. That's authority creating the governed. But no, it's more like students want somebody to teach them, so they might give authority to a teacher so that the teacher only exists to then be a blessing to the students. That's how they saw government, and that was powerfully radical, and again would inform the United States in the type of government the world hadn't seen. Key contrast to the Pilgrims is that they did not separate church and state, because they saw themselves much more as a religious colony trying to set up a religious, what we might call even theocratic state. You had the pastor and the governors, they were one and the same. And if you were in the part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had to be a good Puritan, and you had to go to church, and you had to follow all the strict rules. And we'll talk also this week about some of the conflict that created, because they did not believe in a separation of church and state, because they couldn't abide heresy, because that would create sin and a lack of blessing and a bad example that they were trying to set. Okay, appreciate you hanging in there. Kind of a long lecture. We'll wrap this up. But so what? Why are we talking about the Separatists and the Puritans? Main ideas. Europe is a dangerous place for religious freedom. That's why Columbus, 1492, 25 years before 1517, the Protestant Revolution, and then the ongoing massacre of Protestants like the Huguenots, or the bloody 30 Years' War, or the persecutions of King James and Charles I. There's not room in Europe for religious freedom. Wherever they can eke it out, there's violence, there's fighting, there's history, there's baggage. Limiting that. Again, the religion even is tainted with political power. So if you say, I want to be a Protestant, well, they say, well, they assume you're disloyal to them because they're in charge and they're a Catholic. So it's all kind of twisted and a mess. And so we need this new place for a fresh start. And that's why, again, the juxtaposition of Columbus and Martin Luther is absolutely miraculous, that there was a place for these persecuted minorities, religious minorities, to go and try these new experiments, to take this new idea that Martin Luther and other Protestant leaders had given them and say, what does it look like if we actually try to live this out? And that's what America offers. That's what the New World offered to them, so that it could become kind of a seedbed for these new ideas, a place where they could go and experiment and say, what happens if we create a society based on the Bible? What happens if we create a society based on self-government, or freedom of worship, or separation of church and state? And so it really was, a place for new ideas to be tried and to grow. Also very much a bottom-up approach. In other words, this was not in Spain. The government sent the colonists and basically directed their religion and directed them how to live. In the English colonies, it was the dregs, it was the rejects, it was the persecuted leaving and kind of on their own building up the society from the bottom up. What worked for the people, as I was trying to describe, setting up only a government that was good for the people being governed. Not necessarily, I'm the ruler, let me tell you how I want to govern you. So that's what we mean by a bottom-up approach. And eventually that's going to turn into the idea of a government by the people, of the people, and for the people. And again, we're going to be talking a lot about this idea of covenants. A covenant is this idea of a mutual promise, a mutual combining, a coming together in an agreement together to bind each other together in order to live better. That's what marriage is, a covenant. A man and a woman binding themselves together to have a family and a better life together. God and Abraham, or God and anybody throughout, they covenanted together into a relationship with promises of love and faithfulness and all that to have a better life together. That was the foundation of our nation. These people, whether they're Puritans or pilgrims, coming together and saying, we are going to bind ourselves, Mayflower Compact, model of Christian charity. We're going to bind ourselves together and govern ourselves and see what kind of a society we together can create. And again, that's that idea of government being chosen. Again, we'll talk a lot about marriage, but the rules in my house, or the way that our family is run, that wasn't imposed upon us by some authority above it. That was something my wife and I, we self-governed. We came together and said, so how do we want our family to be run? What do we want our marriage to look like? What do we want the rules our kids to follow, and what do we want them to be taught? A family is a great example of a covenant-based self-government. And these early New England colonies were an attempt to do that in a slightly larger way and say, okay, how can we do this as a society, as a colony? Okay, we'll wrap that up. But again, the exceptional biblical roots of America's founding principles we can find here in the Separatists and the Puritans.